In the quiet town of Brookridge, Kansas, life often moved at an unhurried pace. The town, with a population barely reaching 7,000, was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and everyone knew the names of the local shopkeepers. Summers were hot and sticky, winters cold and biting, but in between, Brookridge offered an almost picturesque calm, a place that appeared untouched by the chaos of the outside world. It was in this seemingly serene setting that the Whitman family had built their reputation as one of the most respected and admired households in the community. Charles Whitman, born in 1976, had lived in Brookridge nearly his entire life. He was a tall, soft-spoken man who worked as a construction supervisor for a local firm and served as a deacon at the Brookridge Baptist Church. To the public eye, Charles embodied the image of the devoted husband and loving father. He was known for mowing not only his lawn but also the lawns of elderly neighbors, for volunteering at the church's food drives, and for always speaking in a calm and measured tone. Those who met him would describe him as steady, honest, and reliable. He had married his high school sweetheart, Laura Bennett, in the summer of 2001. Their wedding at St. Matthew's Chapel had been one of the most celebrated events that year, with half the town attending. Over the following 2 decades, Charles and Laura built what seemed to be a perfect suburban life. They lived in a 2-story brick house on Cedar Lane, surrounded by a neatly trimmed yard with white roses Laura tended with care. They had 2 children, Ethan, born in 2006, and Chloe, born in 2009. To neighbors and friends, the Whitmans appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream. Stable, hardworking, faithful, and close-knit. But beneath this carefully constructed image lay a truth that Charles had buried deep and tried desperately to forget. Back in 2007, when his marriage to Laura was still in its early years, Charles had briefly been involved in an affair with a woman named Melissa Carter. Melissa was a nurse at the local clinic, known for her warm smile and free-spirited nature. At the time, Charles had been under immense stress from long hours at work and the pressures of providing for a young family. Their affair was short-lived, lasting barely a few months, but it resulted in a pregnancy, something neither of them had planned. When Melissa gave birth to a baby girl named Emily on May 18, 2008, Charles was terrified. Determined to preserve his marriage and reputation, Charles made a secret arrangement with Melissa. He provided her with financial support every month but insisted that no one could ever know he was the father. Melissa agreed, fearing public judgment and not wanting to cause chaos in Charles's marriage. They kept their secret hidden from everyone, even from Laura, who remained unaware that her husband was secretly supporting another child. When Emily was 4 years old, tragedy struck. Melissa died unexpectedly from a car accident on a rainy evening in 2012. The news shocked Charles, but he managed to keep his connection to her hidden. Emily, now orphaned, was placed under the guardianship of her maternal aunt, Denise Carter, who lived just a few blocks away from the Whitman residence. Charles continued to quietly send money to help with Emily's care, never revealing the true reason behind his generosity. To everyone else, he simply seemed like a kind man helping a struggling family friend. Years passed, and Charles continued to live what appeared to be a normal, successful life with Laura and their children. He attended church every Sunday, coached his son's little league games, and posted cheerful family photos on social media. But privately, he watched Emily from a distance as she grew up. He occasionally caught glimpses of her walking home from school, her dark hair fluttering in the Kansas wind, her laughter echoing faintly as she played with friends near the town park. He never approached her, never spoke to her, but the knowledge of who she was, and what she represented, hung over him like a shadow he could not escape. This hidden past was the crack in the Whitman family's perfect facade. And as the years went on, that crack would slowly widen, until it tore their entire world apart. By the spring of 2024, Emily Carter was 17 years old and standing on the edge of adulthood. She lived with her aunt, Denise Carter, in a small, weathered house on Willow Street, just 3 blocks away from the Whitman residence. Emily had grown into a striking young woman with sharp green eyes and a quiet, determined presence. She was a junior at Brookridge High School, where she earned decent grades and participated in the school's art club. To her teachers, she appeared mature beyond her years, though they often noted her solitary nature. Emily kept her circle of friends small, preferring to spend afternoons sketching in the park or walking alone through the quiet streets of town. What most people didn't know, and what Emily herself had only recently discovered, was the truth about her parentage. For most of her life, she had believed she was simply an orphan whose mother died tragically and whose father was unknown. Denise, her aunt, had always dodged questions about her father, saying only that he wasn't around or he left before you were born. But Emily had grown suspicious over the years, especially when she noticed the anonymous envelopes of cash that arrived every few months to help with her expenses. Denise would always tuck them away quickly, insisting they came from an old family friend. In January 2024, Emily stumbled across something that shattered her understanding of her own life. While searching through an old box of her late mother's belongings in the attic, she found a bundle of letters, handwritten notes signed only with the initials C. The letters spoke of regret, secrecy, and promises to provide for the child without disrupting his family. One line in particular pierced through her heart. "She can never know I'm her father. No one can." Emily was shaken but also determined. She began investigating quietly, comparing handwriting samples and piecing together old photographs. One photo showed her mother, Melissa, at a community picnic in 2007, standing next to a tall man with broad shoulders and familiar brown eyes. The man was unmistakable, Charles Whitman. The realization hit Emily like a thunderclap. The kind, church-going family man she had passed on the street countless times was her father. At first, Emily didn't know what to do with this knowledge. She spent weeks in turmoil, balancing her anger with a strange yearning. She couldn't understand why he had stayed silent all her life, why he had never once acknowledged her, not even as a distant friend. The secrecy felt like rejection, like she had been erased from existence. The more she thought about it, the more that longing curdled into resentment. By March, Emily decided she could no longer keep the secret to herself. She began drafting a letter to Charles, demanding that he meet her in person. She didn't want to destroy his family, she told herself. She just wanted to be seen, to be told that she mattered to him. But as she wrote, her tone shifted, shaped by years of pent-up anger. The letter grew sharper, more confrontational. She mentioned the possibility of telling Laura Whitman the truth if Charles ignored her. She hinted that she had evidence, those old letters, that could prove everything. Meanwhile, Charles was living what appeared to be the same calm life he had always known. He continued working long hours at the construction company, attending Sunday services, and having dinner with his wife and 2 children each night. But cracks had begun to form even before Emily approached him. Charles had been dealing with silent guilt for years, and the older Emily became, the more she resembled Melissa. Every time he caught a glimpse of her walking down Willow Street, he was jolted back to the mistake he had made 17 years earlier. On April 3, 2024, Emily left the letter on the windshield of Charles's truck while it was parked outside the church. When he found it, his hands trembled. The words were sharp and unyielding. "I know who you are. You're my father. I deserve the truth, and if you won't give it to me, I'll tell your family myself." Charles felt the world collapse around him as he read those lines in the empty parking lot. The paper crumpled in his fist as panic raced through his mind. If Laura found out, if Ethan and Chloe learned the truth, everything he had worked for would unravel. His reputation at the church, his job, the family he had built, all of it could be destroyed by this revelation. 4 days afterward, Charles avoided going near Willow Street. He barely spoke at home, claiming stress from work. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He replayed the letter in his head, hearing Emily's voice even though she had never actually spoken those words aloud to him. He began imagining the shame, the gossip, the looks of betrayal on his wife's face. Emily, meanwhile, grew more impatient. A week passed without a response, and her anger only deepened. She told one of her close friends, Mia Reynolds, that she was planning to make him talk, no matter what. Mia urged her to let it go, warning that nothing good could come from stirring the past, but Emily had made up her mind. The stage was set, though neither of them realized it yet. A desperate father clinging to his fragile facade, and a determined daughter seeking acknowledgement at any cost. The collision between them was inevitable, and it was coming fast. On the chilly evening of April 17, 2024, Brookridge felt quieter than usual. A light drizzle had been falling all afternoon, and by nightfall the streets were slick and mostly empty. Streetlights cast long golden streaks across the wet pavement. Inside his brick house on Cedar Lane, Charles Whitman sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television. Laura and the kids were visiting her sister in Wichita for the week, leaving Charles with an unusual stretch of solitude, one that he had hoped would bring peace, but instead only magnified his anxiety. For 2 weeks, Emily's letter had haunted him. He kept it hidden inside the bottom drawer of his desk at work, though he thought about destroying it almost daily. He couldn't stop replaying its words in his head. The thought of Emily exposing the truth filled him with dread. He pictured Laura's face twisted in disbelief, Ethan and Chloe looking at him as if he were a stranger. In his mind, he heard the whispers of neighbors, the disapproving stares at church. 17 years of secrecy could collapse overnight. Charles had convinced himself that maybe Emily was bluffing, that perhaps she would simply give up. But that hope was shattered when his phone buzzed that afternoon with a text from an unknown number. "If you won't come to me, I'll come to you. Tomorrow. You can't run from this anymore." Charles froze in his office chair as he read the message. His hands grew cold. He stared at the screen for a long time, unable to breathe. There was no mistaking who it was from. Emily had his number now. He didn't know how she got it, and he didn't care. What mattered was that the wall between his secret past and his present life was crumbling fast. That night, after pacing for hours, Charles made a decision he never could have imagined himself making before. He would meet Emily, not to comfort her, not to explain, but to make sure she stayed silent. Somewhere in his panicked mind, twisted logic began to take root. If Emily disappeared, so would the threat she posed. Emily, meanwhile, was restless and angry. She had skipped dinner with Denise and locked herself in her room, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with her sketchbook untouched beside her. She kept rereading the message she had sent, feeling a mix of fear and resolve. She told herself she didn't want to ruin anyone's life. She only wanted her father to admit the truth, to look her in the eye and acknowledge that she existed. But deep down, she also wanted him to suffer the way she had suffered, years of feeling invisible, unwanted, discarded. Around 8 p.m., she slipped out of the house quietly, telling Denise through the door that she was going for a walk. The air smelled of wet earth, and her sneakers splashed softly through puddles as she headed toward the edge of town. She planned to wait near the abandoned Carter storage lot, a half-acre of overgrown land owned long ago by her grandfather, now used by local kids as a hangout spot. It was only 5 blocks from the Whitman home, and she knew Charles often drove past it on his way home from work. At 8:47 p.m., Charles's pickup truck rolled to a stop near the lot. He had spent the last hour driving aimlessly through the outskirts of Brookridge, trying to calm the storm in his mind. When he saw Emily's silhouette waiting under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, his heart lurched. She was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, her hood pulled low over her face. For a moment he almost turned around. He almost drove away and left everything to chance. But instead he parked and got out, his boots crunching against the gravel. Emily turned to face him. Her eyes were sharp, accusing. "You came," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the still air. Charles swallowed. "We can't be here," he muttered. "Someone might see." "No one cares," she replied. "No one ever cared about me. Not even you." The words cut deep. He flinched as if struck. They stood in silence for several long seconds, the drizzle beating on their clothes. Then Emily pulled a small bundle of papers from her backpack, the old letters she had found in her mother's box. She held them out like evidence in a courtroom. "I know everything," she said. "I know you're my father. And if you don't tell your family the truth, I will." Charles's breath hitched. The sight of the letters sent a surge of terror through him. He took a step closer. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "I understand perfectly," Emily snapped. "You get to have a perfect life while I get nothing. That ends now." Something inside Charles snapped. All the fear, the guilt, the years of repression and secrecy boiled over at once. He lunged forward, grabbing the letters from her hand. Emily tried to pull them back, shouting, but Charles shoved her. She stumbled backward into the muddy ground. The sound of her scream echoed off the storage lot's corrugated metal walls. Charles panicked. He didn't think, he only reacted. He reached into the truck, grabbing a heavy wrench from his toolbox and swung it wildly. It connected with Emily's temple with a sickening thud. She collapsed instantly. For several moments, Charles stood frozen, the rain hissing softly around him, the wrench slipping from his trembling fingers. Emily lay motionless, her dark hair fanned out in the mud, her blood mixing with the rainwater. His breathing turned ragged. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice breaking. He knelt beside her, shaking her shoulders, begging her to wake up. But she didn't move. Charles stayed there for almost an hour, paralyzed by what he had done. Finally, just past 10 p.m., he forced himself to act. He wrapped Emily's body in a tarp from the back of his truck, loaded her into the bed, and drove toward a deserted patch of land his family owned on the outskirts of town, a place no one visited anymore. There, under the cold light of the moon, he dug a shallow grave with a rusted shovel, his hands raw and shaking. When it was done, he stood over the mound of disturbed earth, soaked to the bone and trembling. He had erased the threat. He had erased his secret. Or so he thought. At 12:37 a.m., Charles returned home, stripped off his muddy clothes and shoved them deep into a trash bag in the garage. He stood under a scalding shower until his skin turned red, trying to wash away the blood, the smell of damp soil, the memory of his daughter's face as she fell. Outside, Brookridge slept, unaware that its picture-perfect family man had just killed his own child. On the morning of April 18, 2024, Brookridge woke up to the crisp smell of rain-soaked earth. The sun rose pale and slow over the town's narrow streets. But inside the small blue house on Willow Street, panic was already taking root. Denise Carter realized by 7:15 a.m. that Emily had never come home. At first, she thought Emily might have stayed over at a friend's place, though that was uncharacteristic of her. Denise called her phone several times, but it went straight to voicemail. By 8:30 a.m. as the school day began, Denise was on the phone with the Brookridge Police Department, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong," she told the dispatcher. "She didn't come home last night. This isn't like her." Within hours, the case of Emily Carter's disappearance was circulating throughout the small police station on Maple Avenue. Chief of Police Raymond Keller, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, assigned 2 detectives to the case, Detective Hannah Morales and Detective Brian Cole. Both had worked missing persons cases before, though rarely in a town as quiet as Brookridge. By noon, they had spoken with Denise, who provided them with a recent photo of Emily and listed her close friends. Denise also mentioned that Emily had been acting distant and moody lately, though she couldn't explain why. She told them Emily had gone for a walk the previous night around 8 and never returned. Morales and Cole visited Brookridge High School that afternoon. Several of Emily's classmates described her as reserved but kind. One student, Mia Reynolds, hesitated before telling them something important. She said she was going to confront someone, Mia admitted. She didn't say who, just that it was someone important, and that it might change everything. That statement caught Morales' attention. She asked if Emily had mentioned any names, but Mia shook her head. "No," she whispered. She just looked determined. Like nothing was going to stop her. The detectives walked away from the school with growing concern. Emily wasn't the type to run away. Something felt off. By April 19th, the Brookridge Police Department had officially classified Emily as a missing person. Flyers went up around town with her photo and a description of her clothing. Search teams combed nearby parks, alleys, and wooded areas, while officers knocked on doors asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual that night. Charles watched the news reports from his living room couch, his stomach twisted in knots. Every image of Emily on the screen felt like a blade cutting into him. He forced himself to appear calm to maintain his routine. He went to work, smiled at co-workers, attended a brief church meeting, and called Laura and the kids to tell them he missed them. He never let his voice tremble. But each day as the search for Emily widened, the pressure grew heavier. Detectives Morales and Cole began checking surveillance footage from nearby gas stations, convenience stores, and traffic cameras. They found a blurry clip from a street camera at the corner of Willow and 3rd Avenue showing a dark pickup truck passing by around 8:45 p.m. on the night Emily disappeared. The footage was grainy and the license plate was unreadable, but it gave them a possible lead. On April 21st, Morales requested phone records from Emily's carrier. By the next morning, they had confirmation that Emily's phone had gone offline around 9:02 p.m. near the old Carter storage lot. That detail caught Denise off guard. She hadn't even known Emily went near that place. Detectives visited the lot later that day. The ground was still damp from recent rain, and Morales' sharp eyes caught something near the base of a rusted fence. A torn corner of paper, half buried in mud. It appeared to be part of a handwritten letter. She bagged it carefully, sensing it might be connected. They also noticed faint tire tracks in the soft earth, as though a vehicle had pulled off the road recently. Unfortunately, the rain had blurred any clear tread marks. Still, they photographed everything and marked the area for follow-up searches with cadaver dogs. Meanwhile, whispers were beginning to spread through Brookridge. People at the grocery store spoke in hushed voices about Emily's disappearance. Some speculated she had run away. Others feared something darker. Laura, still in Wichita, called Charles constantly for updates, worried about that poor girl from Willow Street. Charles assured her he hadn't heard anything new, forcing his voice to sound calm while his insides felt like they were collapsing. On April 23, detectives got their first real break. A local gas station clerk named Todd Hensley called the tip line after seeing Emily's missing poster. He told them he had seen her around 8:30 p.m. on April 17, walking toward the old Carter storage lot. She looked like she was waiting for someone, he said. Kept checking her phone. Then a dark pickup drove past a few minutes later. Could you see who was driving? Morales asked. Not really, Todd said. It was raining and the windows were tinted. Still, it confirmed part of the timeline. Emily had been heading toward that lot, likely to meet someone. Someone who never came forward. By April 24, public pressure was mounting. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, "Where is Emily Carter?" Candlelight vigils were planned by her classmates. Denise appeared on a regional news broadcast, her face pale and exhausted, pleading for Emily to come home. Detective Morales began quietly considering the possibility of foul play. Though they had no direct evidence yet, the circumstances felt increasingly suspicious. It wasn't like Emily to vanish without contacting anyone. There was also the mysterious piece of a letter found at the scene, still being analyzed at the lab. As days turned into a week, the investigation took on a heavier tone. Police expanded the search area to include vacant properties around Brookridge, including land owned by the Whitman family on the edge of town, a detail that, at the time, seemed like nothing more than standard procedure. For Charles, every new development was like a hammer strike against his fragile calm. He felt the investigation closing in, even though the detectives hadn't looked at him yet. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots, before someone noticed how tense he became whenever Emily's name was mentioned. He told himself he had buried the truth deep enough that no one would ever find it. But the ground where he had left her was starting to betray him. By the morning of April 27, 2024, the search for Emily Carter had reached a breaking point. It had been 10 days since she vanished, and the investigation was beginning to stagnate. Volunteers still combed the woods and fields around Brookridge, but no new evidence had surfaced. Detectives Morales and Cole were frustrated, exhausted, and increasingly convinced that someone in town was withholding information. That same morning, Denise Carter arrived at the police station clutching something in her trembling hands. It was a small, battered journal with a faded blue cover, Emily's. Denise had found it tucked behind a loose floorboard in Emily's room while cleaning. She said she hadn't read much of it, but something inside seemed off. Morales and Cole carefully flipped through the pages. Most entries were typical for a teenager. Comments about school, sketches, song lyrics. But toward the back the tone shifted. Emily had begun writing about discovering the truth about her father. One entry from March 12 stood out. "I know who he is now. He walks past me like I'm invisible, like I don't exist. I hate him for it. I want him to see me. I want the whole world to see me." Another entry dated April 2 was even more unsettling. "If he won't tell them, I will. He can't hide forever. I'm done being a secret." Morales felt a chill crawl up her spine as she read. "She knew who her father was," she said softly. Cole nodded, frowning. "And whoever he is, she was threatening to expose him." For the first time they had a concrete lead, a motive. Emily might have confronted someone about her parentage the night she disappeared, and that confrontation could have turned violent. They began compiling a list of men who had known Melissa Carter 17 years earlier. Melissa had died in a car accident when Emily was 4, leaving behind few records, but the detectives tracked down an old community center photo from 2007. It showed Melissa at a summer picnic, smiling beside several neighbors. One of them was unmistakably Charles Whitman. When Charles's name appeared on their radar, it was almost by accident. Cole recognized him immediately. "He's the guy from the church," Cole said. "Everyone in town knows him." Morales raised an eyebrow. "Married, 2 kids, clean record, doesn't fit the profile." Still, they couldn't ignore the photo. Morales dug deeper. She discovered that Charles had quietly purchased the overgrown plot of land on the outskirts of town back in 2012, the same area their search teams had swept half-heartedly the week before. On April 28, Morales requested phone location data for Charles's cell phone on the night Emily vanished. The results arrived late that evening. The data showed Charles's phone had been near the Carter storage lot at approximately 8:50 p.m. on April 17, the same window when Emily's phone went dark. Morales stared at the printout, her heartbeat quickening. It was circumstantial, but it was the first hard evidence tying anyone to the scene. "We need to talk to him," she said. The next day, April 29th, they brought Charles into the station for a voluntary interview. Charles arrived wearing a pressed shirt and forced a polite smile, though his palms were sweating. He told them he barely knew Emily, that he had seen her around the neighborhood, but had never spoken to her. Morales watched him carefully. "Where were you on the night of April 17th? "Home," Charles replied smoothly. "My wife was out of town, so I stayed in and watched TV. Can anyone confirm that?" "No," he said after a pause. "Just me." As the questioning continued, Charles felt the walls closing in. He kept his tone calm, but his mind was racing. Did they know? Had someone seen him? Every time Morales mentioned Emily's name, his throat tightened. After an hour, they let him go, without charges, without even labeling him a suspect. But as Charles walked out of the station into the bright afternoon sunlight, he knew the tide was turning. They were circling him now. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing Emily's voice in the dark. "You can't run from this anymore." He began thinking about leaving town, taking a job in another state, starting over. But he knew it wouldn't work. They would dig. They would keep digging until they found her. On May 2nd, the twist finally broke open. A cadaver dog unit swept the Whitman family's vacant lot on the edge of town, this time with more thoroughness. Near a cluster of wild shrubs, one of the dogs alerted. Officers began digging carefully, and within 2 feet of the surface, they uncovered a corner of blue tarp. Moments later, they found human remains. The site was immediately sealed off as a crime scene. Morales stood silently at the edge of the pit, her stomach turning as the tarp was pulled back to reveal the decomposed body of a teenage girl. The clothing matched Emily's description. A coroner on scene confirmed the presence of a skull fracture consistent with blunt force trauma. The discovery hit Brookridge like a shockwave. The missing person case had just become a homicide. By May 3rd, DNA tests confirmed what everyone feared. The body was Emily Carter. And buried alongside her, wrapped in the same tarp, was something Morales hadn't expected. Several crumpled, mud-stained letters, each signed only with the initial C. They were the same letters Emily had taken from her mother's attic. Though smeared and water-damaged, enough words were legible to suggest an affair, and to strongly imply paternity. One sentence stood out clearly. "I will provide for her quietly. She can never know the truth." Morales read it twice, then whispered, "She did know." This was the twist the case needed, the dark secret at its center. Emily had confronted the man she believed to be her father, and that confrontation had cost her life. For Morales, the evidence was stacking fast. Emily's journal, the letters, the cell phone data, the hidden body on property owned by Charles Whitman. The story Charles had spent 17 years burying was finally clawing its way to the surface. And now Morales was determined to prove it beyond any doubt. The days following Detective Harris's confrontation with Charles were thick with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Brookridge, usually so quiet, seemed to hold its breath. Rumors swirled around town, but no one dared say them out loud. The Whitman house, once a symbol of suburban peace, had become a fortress of silence. Curtains stayed closed. Lights flickered on at odd hours. No one saw Charles mowing the lawn anymore or Laura tending her roses. Inside, the family was unraveling. Charles barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, her wide eyes, her open mouth, the way she had crumpled to the floor. He heard the sharp crack of the blow echoing over and over in his mind. He told himself it had been an accident, but even that word, accident, had begun to sound hollow. He stayed up late pacing the hallway, drinking black coffee that turned cold in his hands. His hands trembled. His voice trembled. His entire sense of self, carefully built over decades, was collapsing. Laura, meanwhile, was no longer asking questions, at least not out loud. Something inside her had gone quiet. Since learning the truth about Emily and Charles's affair, she moved through the house like a ghost. She no longer looked Charles in the eye, no longer set a place for him at dinner. She focused on Ethan and Chloe, keeping them away from the police, away from the chaos, away from the truth. But deep inside, Laura was battling her own storm of emotions: betrayal, disgust, grief, and a bone-deep fear of what her husband had become. Detective Harris pressed forward relentlessly. Forensic teams scoured the wooded area where Emily's body had been found. They recovered strands of hair, a broken bracelet clasp, and several pieces of torn clothing. More importantly, they found traces of soil and pine needles that matched the debris lodged in the treads of Charles's work boots. DNA tests were rushed through the state lab in Topeka, and the results came back on the night of October 18, 2022. The blood found on a shovel in Charles's shed was a match to Emily Carter. It was the piece Harris needed to move from suspicion to certainty. The next morning, October 19th, dawned gray and cold. Harris arrived at the Whitman house with a warrant. He and two uniformed officers stood on the porch while frost clung to the edges of the rose bushes. When Charles opened the door, his face was pale and drawn. He didn't resist when Harris read him his rights. Laura stood at the top of the stairs, clutching the banister with white knuckles, her face expressionless as her husband was led away in handcuffs. Ethan cried out. Chloe buried her face in Laura's side. The perfect image of the Whitman family shattered completely in that moment, falling like glass to the ground. At the station, Charles was placed in an interview room under bright fluorescent lights. Hours dragged on as he sat in silence, staring at the table. Eventually, Harris entered and laid down the evidence one piece at a time: the shovel, the boots, the torn bracelet, the phone location data. With each item, Charles's shoulders sank lower. His lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came out. Finally, Harris said quietly, "She was your daughter, Charles. You could have saved her. Why didn't you?" Something broke inside him then. Charles began to talk. His voice was low and ragged, barely audible, as he described everything: how Emily had confronted him, how she had threatened to reveal the affair, how he had begged her to stay silent. He said she had called him a coward, said she would destroy him, and he had snapped. He didn't remember hitting her. He said it felt like his mind had gone white, like a switch had flipped. When he realized what he had done, it was too late. He panicked. He carried her body into the woods under the cover of night, buried her beneath a blanket of pine needles, and went home to his sleeping family as if nothing had happened. Harris listened without interrupting, his pen still in his hand but unmoving. When Charles finished, the room was silent except for the hum of the overhead light. For the first time in decades, Charles stopped pretending. The mask he had worn so carefully, the loving father, the devoted husband, the model citizen, was gone. What remained was a hollowed-out man who had destroyed everything he had ever tried to protect. Meanwhile, news of the confession spread quickly. Brookridge was stunned. People who had once waved to Charles from their porches now whispered his name in horror. The church removed him as deacon. Ethan and Chloe were pulled out of school after classmates began hurling questions and cruel remarks. Laura, devastated and humiliated, filed for legal separation the same week. The Whitman house, now empty except for Laura and the children, stood like a tombstone for a life that had been built on lies. As Charles sat in his cell awaiting arraignment, he replayed the past in his mind like a broken film reel. Every smile, every baseball game, every Sunday morning at church, all of it was stained now. He thought about Emily's laughter in the park years ago, how he had watched her from a distance, too afraid to be her father. And now she was gone, and it was his hands that had taken her from the world. The realization settled over him like a final, crushing weight. There was no redemption left for him. There was only the truth, and the ruin it had left behind. On the cold morning of December 12, 2022, the courthouse in Topeka, Kansas, was packed to capacity. Journalists filled the back rows, their cameras poised. Former neighbors, church members, and even old co-workers came, not out of support but out of disbelief. A desire to see for themselves that the man they had once trusted was capable of such a crime. Charles Whitman entered the courtroom wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and shackles. He looked older, thinner, as though the weight of what he had done had hollowed him out from the inside. His eyes never lifted from the floor. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. The affair with Melissa Carter, the years of secret payments, the tension after Emily confronted him, the GPS data, the blood on the shovel, and finally, his recorded confession. They painted Charles as a man driven by fear and selfish pride, willing to kill his own daughter to preserve the image of perfection he had built. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming Charles had acted in a dissociative state of panic. But the jury was unmoved. On December 27, 2022, the verdict was read. Charles Whitman was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. When the judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a ripple of gasps swept through the room. Charles showed no visible reaction. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, then allowed the bailiffs to lead him away. He did not look back at the gallery. He did not look at Laura or the children who had not come to court at all. In Brookridge, the aftermath was like a lingering shadow. The Whitman house on Cedar Lane went up for sale. The white roses withered in their beds, untended. Laura quietly moved with Ethan and Chloe to her sister's home in Colorado, seeking a place where their last name wouldn't be whispered in grocery store aisles or printed on front pages. The town that had once celebrated the Whitmans now spoke of them in hushed tones, as if the mere mention might summon the darkness that had fallen over their lives. Emily Carter was laid to rest beside her mother in the Brookridge Cemetery. At her funeral, only a handful of people came: her Aunt Denise, a few school friends, and Detective Harris, who stood at the back with his hat in his hands. Her grave marker was simple: Emily Rose Carter, 2008 to 2022. Loved and remembered. There were no flowers from the Whitman family. There never would be. In prison, Charles lived in near total silence. He avoided the yard, avoided conversation, avoided the world. He spent his days in the library reading old theology books, and his nights lying awake in the dark. Some guards said he never spoke except to answer roll call. Others said they sometimes heard him whispering apologies to no one in particular. No visitors came. No letters arrived. It was as if he had been erased from the life he once had. What lingered, however, was the legacy of his crime. The reminder that even in places that seem the safest, the greatest danger can come from within. And for those who had once believed in the Whitman family's perfect image, the truth remained like a scar across the town's memory, proof that behind even the brightest facades, darkness can quietly grow, waiting for the day it breaks through.